And joining us from Prague is the director of the EU Asian Centre for Strategic Studies, Mr. Maher Firzli, to discuss the latest developments on the South Korean economy and the impact of presidential decisions on overall stability. And welcome to Qnews, Mr. Firzli, to Economic Bulletin. And let me start off by asking you, what were the main reasons behind the president's decision to declare martial law, do you think, and what led to this reversal of his decision?
Delighted to join you today from Prague. As they used to say during the First Cold War, which pitted Britain against Russia in the 19th century, and there was a rivalry between Moscow and London for the control of Asia, including Korea, and back then commentators and experts called it a tournament of shadows or a rivalry of shadows. And when you have shadows, it means the situation is very murky, very dark. So it's hard to make sense of what happened in Korea in the past 24 hours. So I'll give you my personal opinion. So I think it was a desperate attempt by the president to turn the tables, which failed miserably in just half a day. And I think the two reasons were the following. The first one is the opposition, which is a center-left, moderate opposition. So we should keep that in mind for the financial impact of a possible destitution or impeachment of the president. The opposition in South Korea is not radical or extremist. They're moderate, center-left. So they were trying in the past few months to put pressure on him, and even inside his own party. So his own party would be center-right conservative. There were many MPs not happy about his policies, so he was a little bit desperate from a domestic policy standpoint. I think it's not enough to justify a brutal military coup. So in my personal opinion, there was something else, and it's just my personal opinion. I think there are some radical elements inside the Biden White House, which are the Democrat equivalent of George W. Bush's neoconservatives. So they are called liberal hawks. So people like Tony Blinken, right, who's quite famous or infamous, shall I say, in the Middle East. So Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, are really, in control of the foreign policy, national security apparatus inside the Biden White House, and they only have 6-7 weeks left in power before Trump moves in. And I think they are bitter, Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, and what you could call the deep state. They're very bitter and anxious about the Trump presidency, and they're willing to do anything to torpedo Trump before he moves into the White House on the 20th of January. So I suspect these guys, some elements within the Biden White House, they may have put pressure on the South Korean president, and they may have, encouraged him to do that totally foolish
Mr. Firzli, let me just also ask you a next question, which is how do these political disruptions, do you think, affect the investor confidence in South Korea's economy?
What's good, and it's really a miracle, not much. So if you look at the main, variables, the currency, the won, the yield on the 10-year government bond, which today it was at 2.72%. If you look at all the KOSPI, the main blue chip equity index today only lost 1.3, 1.4%, considering the fact that we had a full-fledged right-wing military coup 24 hours ago. The short answer to your question is not much. So the Korean economy was able to bite the bullet, and so far, in spite of that huge political instability, etc., the economic situation in South Korea is quite good. Why? Because it's a very rich country with low debt, very low debt, and huge reserves. Okay. So when a country is rich, has a lot of dollars and euros and gold, and when the debt to GDP ratio is low, which is the case for South Korea. When a big crisis happens, what's beautiful is the country is strong enough to absorb the shock. And we are witnessing that in real time for South Korea, even though the shock was huge, financially, economically, so far, they were able to bite the bullet.
But then what do you think the impact would be of this decision expected to have on the financial markets or foreign investment levels in the country?
Not much, because I think people understand that because he failed miserably yesterday, the president is a spent force. And they know that the army doesn't support him, parliament. So it's not like he has a big power. He's still the president for a few weeks, but in essence, they clipped his wings. And so now the country is in autopilot. The risk of another coup is close to zero. And so the country is in autopilot. And when you have lots of cash reserves, it doesn't matter. I think more broadly, what's distressing for foreign investors is to see that a solid country, a civilized, democratic, liberal country like South Korea, yesterday came close to becoming a military dictatorship. And so it's sending signals to investors that emerging markets, even the rich one, even the developed ones, may be less stable than they seem. So I think, ironically, it may impact not South Korea itself, it may impact other Asian, Latin American, African economies, and the perception of risk. Western investors may have now a perception of emerging market risk, which is higher than it was 24 hours ago, sadly.
But then how do you think the government can restore economic stability amid these political fluctuations?
Well, this is the thing. There isn't a big effort to make because, soon the president will leave. That's a certainty. And whoever rules, be it the center-right party, which is in government today, or the moderate, centrist, center-left opposition, to make a long story short, nothing much would change. So Korea is a fairly stable country, fairly rich. It has a lot of positive things going for it. So I think the long-term perception of Korea is quite positive. To be honest, this whole thing started, it was kind of a fit of madness by the president, but it's very limited. And I will argue, once again, my personal opinion, the White House put pressure on him. And because North Korea now is involved in the Russia-Ukrainian war, which is sad, but it's a fact. Some people in Washington said, because North Korea is involved in the Russian-Ukrainian war, let's now involve South Korea, which is very silly. And I think because of that silly pressure, we had what we saw yesterday. But once again, it's a limited storm. It's a storm in a teacup.
How would you think the government can alleviate the domestic and international concerns about the future of the economic growth after these events?
Once again, in my opinion, the risk is limited, the anxiety is limited. If the president is smart, he should resign literally in the next 2-3 days. If he doesn't resign, if he clings to power, he will be impeached and he will be kicked out in 5 or 6 weeks. So the question is, will he resign in 2 days? Will he be kicked out by force in 5 weeks? Honestly, the difference between the two will not make a big difference. And we see it in the financial markets. Today, most financial, investors, they did not short, in these circumstances, if the crisis was real, they would have shorted massively the government bonds and the won and the Kospi index. And like I said, all these financial variables are fairly stable. So I think, to make a long story short, there's nothing much to worry. It would be better if the president resigned, but worst case scenario, he would be out in 5 weeks anyway.
Okay. Well, that was Mr. Maher Firzli. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Firzli. And now we move on to the latest developments around the world.